June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll. The morning sky hangs wide and silent over the endless Pacific. Then a low hum builds, engines straining at full throttle. Two Grumman F4F Wildcats tear through the thin cloud layer, their blue-gray fuselages shuddering under the weight of violent turns. Behind them, the sun catches a glint of silver. Mitsubishi A6M Zeroes, sleek, fast, and hungry for the kill. The Wildcats dive hard, the air vibrating against their wings. Tracer fire rips past, red threads flashing through the clouds. Every second counts. The Zeroes climb effortlessly, turning inside their American prey, closing for the final shot. Then, something unexpected happens. Instead of fleeing, the Wildcats curve toward each other, a synchronized dance at impossible speed. The two fighters cross paths in a perfect X, each pilot covering the other's tail. A Zero, unable to follow both, slips straight into the trap. One burst from the .50 caliber guns and it's over. The Japanese fighter explodes in flame, falling toward the dark blue sea. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach steadies his breathing. Over the radio, his voice is calm but edged with disbelief. It works. The weave works. What began as a quiet experiment, matchsticks on a kitchen table, has just changed aerial warfare forever. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, its naval aviators faced a terrifying reality. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the skies. Their pilots were highly trained, their aircraft faster and more agile, and their tactics refined through years of combat over China. For many American pilots, the first encounters felt less like battles and more like lessons in survival. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was at the center of it all, light, fast, and brutally efficient. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and outmaneuver nearly every American fighter in the early months of the war. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, the Zero was unmatched. It could loop and roll with breathtaking agility, and in the hands of a veteran pilot, it seemed untouchable. Facing it was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Sturdy, dependable, but painfully slower. It was heavier, less responsive, and climbed like a brick compared to the nimble Zero. American pilots soon discovered that a one-on-one duel with a Japanese fighter almost always ended the same way, in smoke and fire. By the spring of 1942, the situation was becoming desperate. Reports from the front described entire squadrons being wiped out within minutes. The Zero's long range and maneuverability allowed Japanese carriers to strike deep, while U.S. forces struggled to adapt. But inside the chaos, a handful of officers began to think differently. They studied the enemy, noted patterns, and searched for weaknesses not in the aircraft, but in the tactics. Among them was a 35-year-old naval aviator from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach. Thach was not a reckless ace or a headline hero. He was methodical, analytical, the kind of pilot who saw the sky as a chessboard. Before the war, he'd served as an instructor, teaching gunnery and formation flying. His students remembered him for his calm precision and insistence that every move in the air should have purpose. When he began hearing reports about the Japanese Zero, its impossible turning radius, its vertical climb, Thach didn't panic. He studied. He gathered every piece of intelligence available, interviewing pilots who had survived encounters and dissecting the tactics that led to their near destruction. The problem was simple and terrifying. The Wildcat couldn't outfly the Zero. It couldn't turn tighter, climb faster, or accelerate away. Any pilot who tried to fight on the Zero's terms would die. So Thach set out to find another way. A system not built on superior speed, but on teamwork and geometry. Late one evening at his kitchen table in San Diego, he laid out matchsticks on the surface. He moved them in crisscrossing lines, testing patterns like a tactician moving pieces on a board. His wife, watching from across the room, saw a man quietly sketching the future of naval air combat. What if, he thought, two American fighters flew close together, side by side, and when attacked, turned toward each other instead of away? The maneuver would create overlapping fields of fire, forcing an enemy on one pilot's tail directly into the guns of the other. It would turn the Wildcats' slower speed into a trap, not a weakness. Thach believed it could work, but few others did. The idea seemed too risky, too coordinated to survive real combat. Even among his peers, the concept was met with skepticism. But Thach was convinced that if American pilots were to survive, they had to fight smarter, not faster. He called it the beam defense position. His men simply called it the Thach Weave. And soon, it would face the ultimate test against the best fighter pilots Japan had to offer. By early 1942, the Pacific was still a Japanese ocean. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, Japan's rapid advance had shattered every illusion of Allied superiority. Their air wings, operating from carriers like Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, seemed invincible. Wherever the rising sun appeared in the sky, American and British aircraft fell in flames. In this grim landscape, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach, now commanding Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, aboard the USS Lexington, prepared his men for what felt like a war of attrition. He understood that no amount of courage could overcome physics. If his Wildcats entered turning duels with Zeroes, they would die, plain and simple. But courage was not what he demanded from his pilots. He demanded discipline. He demanded precision, formation trust, and coordination that bordered on instinct. And he believed that his new defensive maneuver, the Thach Weave, could give them a fighting chance. Thach trained his squadron relentlessly. At first, his men were doubtful. The idea of turning toward an attacking aircraft went against every instinct a fighter pilot possessed. "You don't fly into danger," one pilot remarked. "You fly away from it." But Thach's calm authority silenced debate. He would fly the lead himself, with his wingman maintaining strict formation. The maneuver, he explained, required absolute timing. Two planes flying in parallel courses, roughly a few hundred yards apart. When an enemy latched onto one fighter's tail, both would simultaneously turn toward each other, crossing paths and exposing the attacker to counterfire from the wingman. In training flights off the coast of Hawaii, the results were immediate and surprising. The attacker found himself constantly sliding into a trap, unable to stay behind either Wildcat for long. The crossing arcs forced him to disengage or die. Pilots began to see it less as a trick and more as a tactical revolution. Still, theory was not proof. Thach knew that in combat, chaos was the rule. Visibility, radio interference, damage, all could break the delicate choreography of the weave. The only true test would come under fire. In the spring of 1942, as the U.S. prepared to confront Japan's expanding reach, Thach was reassigned to USS Yorktown, CV-5, one of the few operational American carriers left after Pearl Harbor. The stage was shifting toward a small ring of coral and sand halfway between Asia and America. Midway Atoll. U.S. cryptanalysts had broken portions of the Japanese naval code, predicting a major attack on Midway in early June. Every available carrier was rushed to intercept. For Thach and his pilots, this would be their baptism of fire against the Zero. The odds were staggering. Japan would bring over 100 carrier-based fighters and bombers, crewed by veterans of the China War. The U.S. Navy could muster barely half that number, most of them flying older Wildcats. But within those cockpits sat the first men to carry Thach's idea into real battle. On the morning of June 4, 1942, as Yorktown's decks came alive with fuel lines and spinning propellers. Thach's flight crew ran through their briefing. The enemy's Zeroes, they knew, would come fast and low, diving on bomber formations, then circling back for stragglers. The key, Thach reminded them, was discipline. Stay in pairs. Watch your wingman. When attacked, don't panic. Turn toward him, not away. It sounded almost suicidal, but there was no other choice. As the sun rose over the vast Pacific horizon, Wildcats rolled down the deck, lifting into the humid air. Their engines roared, propellers glinting with salt light. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan's elite fighter wings were already in motion. In the coming hours, the skies above Midway would become a crucible, where raw courage, desperate innovation, and a handful of American pilots would test one man's theory against one of the most lethal air forces on Earth. And high above that turquoise ring of coral, the Thach Weave would make its debut, not as a training exercise, but as the difference between life and death. In air combat, seconds decide life or death. For John S. Thach, those seconds were not about luck. They were about design. Every move in the air was a calculation. The Thach Weave wasn't just a maneuver. It was an expression of his entire philosophy of warfare. He believed that victory belonged to those who could think under fire. But behind that calm exterior was a growing weight. His pilots weren't machines. They were young men, many barely out of their teens. Each time he looked into their faces during pre-flight briefings, he saw determination mixed with quiet fear. The Pacific was vast and merciless. If a pilot went down, chances of rescue were slim. The Japanese Zero pilots, trained for years in precision and aggression, had turned aerial combat into an art of domination. Their approach was elegant, fluid, and fatal. American pilots were taught courage, but courage alone could not outfly the Zero. Thach understood this. He was not seeking glory. He was seeking survival systems. His maneuver was built not around the ego of the ace, but the unity of two men who trusted each other completely. When two Wildcats flew the Weave, their bond became the weapon. Each man was both shield and sword for the other. In training, Thach insisted on silence between pilots during the maneuver. No chatter, no panic, just timing. When an enemy appeared behind one aircraft, the other had to instinctively turn in perfect unison. It was a ballet of geometry, trust, and steel nerves. For Thach, the true innovation wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. He was teaching pilots to abandon the instinct to flee. "Don't run," he told them. "Run together." This shift in mindset was revolutionary. It demanded absolute faith in formation discipline, something the U.S. Navy had struggled to maintain under pressure. In early Pacific engagements, many American pilots broke formation at the first sign of danger, a fatal error against the coordinated Japanese. The Thach Weave flipped that instinct on its head. When the enemy pursued, the Americans didn't scatter. They converged. For the men of VF-3 and later VF-42, this required endless drills. One pilot recalled years later, "You didn't think about the Weave, you felt it. When Thach turned, you turned. When he fired, you fired." The maneuver became second nature, a reflex burned into muscle memory. But even among Thach's peers, there was skepticism. Some senior officers dismissed it as too complex, too risky for real battle conditions. Others feared that the close crossing paths could lead to mid-air collisions. Yet Thach pressed on, knowing that innovation rarely earns approval before it earns results. In those tense weeks before Midway, he recorded every practice flight, adjusting distances, refining timing. He measured the perfect spacing between aircraft, close enough for mutual defense, wide enough to avoid collision. He tested reaction windows to enemy approach speeds and trained pilots to identify the precise moment to initiate the turn. The Weave, at its core, was mathematics in motion. But when seen from the cockpit, with tracers arcing through the sky and the ocean spinning below, it became something else. Trust under fire. Thach's pilots understood what it meant to rely entirely on another man's skill. And that bond, forged not in theory, but in training and fear, would soon be the difference between returning to deck or vanishing into the sea. Because the moment they faced the Zeroes for real, every calculation, every rehearsal, every heartbeat of coordination would be tested in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable: the skies over Midway. To understand why Thach's invention worked, one must first understand what it was up against. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was a masterpiece of engineering, the product of designer Jiro Horikoshi's pursuit of aerial perfection. It was light, agile, and built with a single-minded focus on maneuverability. To achieve that, engineers stripped away almost everything that added weight. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, even bulletproof glass. The result was a fighter that could turn on a dime, climb like a hawk, and outmaneuver anything in the sky. In 1941 and early 1942, the Zeroes' dominance was absolute. Against the British over Malaya, against the Americans at Wake Island, and across the Philippines, it shredded Allied formations. Many of the early dogfights were massacres, not because the Americans lacked courage, but because they lacked a weapon or tactic to counter the Zeroes' physics. Japanese pilots, veterans of the Long War in China, carried an air of effortless superiority. They were trained to engage in vertical spirals and tight horizontal turns, using the Zeroes' light frame to force their opponents into losing energy. To them, American aircraft, heavier and slower, were predictable targets, and for a time, that was true. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, the U.S. Navy's main carrier fighter in 1942, was a machine of contradictions. It was tough, reliable, and heavily armed, but slower by nearly 60 miles per hour than the Zero. Its climb rate was inferior, and its turning radius was hopeless in comparison. Yet, hidden beneath its bulk was its greatest advantage: durability. The Wildcat could absorb damage that would tear a Zero apart. Thach saw this not as a limitation, but as an opportunity. If the Zero's power came from lightness, then its weakness was fragility. If the Wildcat's power came from toughness, then survival, not elegance, was the key to victory. The Thach Weave exploited that weakness beautifully. The maneuver forced the Zero into sustained pursuit patterns, where its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks made it vulnerable. Japanese pilots, trained to hunt single targets, often became fixated, following one Wildcat too long and flying straight into the guns of the other. From the Japanese cockpit, it must have been bewildering. The Americans were supposed to scatter, not turn into each other's fire. The sight of two enemy fighters moving as one, crossing paths deliberately, was unlike anything they had faced before. After the war, Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the most skilled Zero pilots, described his shock at American formations that seemed to move as if controlled by one mind. He admitted that once the Americans began flying coordinated defensive tactics, the advantage of the Zero diminished quickly. What Thach had invented was more than a maneuver. It was tactical evolution. It turned the individual duel, the romantic image of the lone ace, into a coordinated system. It transformed American air combat doctrine from instinct to method, and in that method lay the seeds of long-term superiority. Once adopted, the Thach Weave began to appear in every engagement, from the coral skies of Guadalcanal to the vast blue expanse of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese still had faster planes, but they could no longer isolate or overwhelm their prey. Each American pilot now had a partner, and together they made the sky a far more dangerous place for the Zero. The next time Japanese fighters met the Wildcats above Midway, they didn't face panic or chaos. They faced geometry, cold, calculated, and deadly. And that geometry was about to prove itself in combat for the very first time. June 4th, 1942. The Central Pacific. The skies above Midway Atoll shimmered with heat, a horizon of ocean and fire. By dawn, the Japanese combined fleet had unleashed the most powerful carrier strike force the world had ever seen. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, protected by dozens of Mitsubishi A6M Zeroes. Their mission was simple: destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers and crush American morale. Opposing them were Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, battered survivors of earlier months of retreat. Among their fighter groups were the F4F Wildcats, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thach. What began as another desperate defense would soon become a turning point in air warfare itself, when the first wave of Japanese dive bombers appeared over Midway's airspace. American fighters scrambled to intercept. The Wildcats, slower and fewer in number, faced overwhelming odds. Dozens of Zeroes descended from the sun, their machine guns flashing white streaks in the blue. In the chaos of the swirling dogfight, Thach's formation, 4 Wildcats, became the target of a dozen Zeroes diving in from high altitude. The odds were impossible, but Thach had been waiting for this exact moment. He called his wingman, Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, on the radio, calm, precise. "Let's weave." The maneuver began almost imperceptibly. 2 Wildcats flying side by side turned inward toward each other, crossing paths in a synchronized arc. Each covered the other's tail. The Zeroes, expecting the Americans to break away or climb, instead found themselves flying directly into converging lines of 50 caliber gunfire. The first Zero burst into flame, then another. In seconds, the entire geometry of the engagement changed. Instead of chasing helpless targets, the Japanese were being funneled into kill zones, each twist of their pursuit feeding into the Americans' crossfire. The air filled with smoke trails and shredded aluminum. What had been chaos now became pattern. Cold, deliberate precision in motion. Observers later described it as 2 pairs of planes moving as if tethered by an invisible wire. Each turn was measured, each roll mirrored. The Zeroes tried to split them, to climb above and dive. But the Wildcats' constant weaving denied them clean shots. The Japanese advantage in speed was meaningless when the Americans refused to fight alone. For nearly 20 minutes, Thach's division held against superior numbers. By the time the surviving Zeroes broke off, 2 had been shot down, several others damaged, and every Wildcat made it home. It was a small skirmish within the vast storm of Midway, but its effect rippled far beyond the atoll. Other pilots who witnessed it returned to their carriers with a new understanding. The Thach Weave worked, not just on paper, not just in drills, but in combat, under fire, against the enemy that had dominated the Pacific skies. Word spread across the fleet within hours. Pilots began rehearsing the maneuver, memorizing its rhythm: turn, cross, cover. By the time the Japanese fleet retreated from Midway, their carriers burning, their elite aircrews lost, American fighter doctrine had quietly evolved. The victory at Midway would be remembered for the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers. But for those who fought in the air, another victory took place. A shift from fear to confidence, from improvisation to mastery, and at its center stood a man who had refused to believe that defeat was inevitable. In the aftermath of Midway, as the Pacific quieted under the drifting haze of oil fires, the surviving U.S. pilots gathered in briefing rooms lit by dim red lamps. They had witnessed something revolutionary, a maneuver that had defied mathematics, reversed instinct, and turned survival into dominance. Lieutenant Commander John Thach stood before the chalkboard aboard USS Enterprise, sketching intersecting lines with the precision of an engineer. "These are your lifelines," he said. "No matter who you're flying against, keep your partner's tail covered. Don't chase, don't climb. Weave." It was the first time many young aviators realized that discipline could defeat speed. The Japanese Zero was still the most agile fighter in the Pacific. It could outturn and outclimb the Wildcat at nearly every altitude. But Thach had shown that two minds thinking as one could trap even the most skilled opponent. Soon, the Thach Weave was no longer just an experiment. It was standard training doctrine across the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. From the Solomons to the Coral Sea, American fighter divisions began flying in interlocking pairs, constantly covering each other's blind spots. Reports poured in from carriers and island bases. Enemy ambushes were failing. Pilots who once dreaded the sudden flash of a Zero behind them were now turning the tables, luring their pursuers into lines of fire. At Guadalcanal, the tactics saved lives daily. Marine pilots of VMF 223 credited the maneuver for surviving endless aerial duels over Henderson Field. They called it the weave that saved the Wildcat. By late 1942, Japanese pilots, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean, were writing in their diaries of growing frustration. "The Americans no longer flee. They turn toward us, and we cannot reach their tails." That single observation marked a psychological turning point. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility, built on years of unchallenged dominance, began to fracture. Training footage from the U.S. Navy's Polihu. Instructional films in early 1943 shows grainy reels of Wildcats performing synchronized turns, their movements graceful, mechanical, exact. Narrators explained how mutual defense could break the enemy's energy advantage, forcing the Zero into predictable overshoots. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was American, born of teamwork, patience, and calculation rather than instinct alone. As new aircraft arrived, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, the Thach Weave adapted and endured. The newer planes no longer needed to fear the Zero, yet they continued to use the tactic because it worked. A doctrine of unity, written in the heat of desperation and proven in the skies above Midway. Even the Japanese, after analyzing post-war footage, admitted their shock. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, remarked in 1947, "We could not match such coordination." We underestimated how quickly the Americans would learn. From that moment forward, U.S. fighter squadrons operated with a single creed. No man fights alone. The innovation, born from one pilot's insight, had become the unbreakable backbone of American aerial warfare, transforming the Pacific Air Campaign from survival to supremacy. And as the war pushed onward, teens toward the Marianas, the Philippines, and finally, Japan. Every U.S. pilot who weaved in the sky carried a fragment of that first encounter at Midway, a legacy not of invention for glory, but of survival turned into victory. By the late summer of 1942, the U.S. Navy's intelligence and operations reports began recording a shift no one had expected so soon. Japanese air losses were rising sharply, not just from better aircraft or radar, but from tactical transformation. At the root of that transformation was the Thach Weave. Naval aviation schools from Pensacola to San Diego began integrating the maneuver into their core syllabus. New cadets, some barely out of high school, learned to fly not as individuals but as synchronized pairs, sections that thought and moved as one. The once simple act of turning toward your wingman had become an instinct trained into every American pilot. Film reels of training sessions show instructors shouting over roaring engines, Cross! Cross! Watch your partner's tail! The sound of synchronized throttles filled the airfields, a mechanical chorus of learning. By 1943, reports from VF-6 aboard USS Enterprise and VMF-124 in the Solomons described how even rookie pilots survived encounters with seasoned Japanese aces. They no longer panicked when attacked. They turned, crossed, and fought back. In one such engagement, near the Russell Islands, a formation of 4 Wildcats used the Weave to ambush 8 Zeroes. 2 Japanese fighters were shot down within seconds, another crippled, and the Americans returned unscathed. A post-action report noted simply, "The maneuver proved decisive. Enemy pursuit tactics neutralized." Back in Japan, captured combat film puzzled analysts. How could the slower, less agile Wildcat consistently evade and strike back? A Navy intelligence summary from late 1943 noted, "Enemy air units express frustration that American pilots act as if bound by invisible coordination." What they were witnessing was more than a tactic. It was the embodiment of American military philosophy. Coordination over chaos, teamwork over instinct, reason over impulse. As the war expanded across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, the Gilberts, this doctrine became gospel. It trained not only pilots, but ground crews, gunners, and even destroyer captains who adapted similar cross-cover concepts in naval escort formations. Lieutenant Commander Thach, meanwhile, was promoted to the staff of Admiral Nimitz, where he contributed to new aerial defense tactics for carrier groups. His quiet demeanor masked the weight of what he had achieved. When questioned about the success of his maneuver, he once said modestly, "It wasn't genius, it was necessity. We had to survive." Yet that necessity had reshaped an entire war. The Japanese, once dominant in the skies, began losing not because their aircraft grew worse, but because the Americans had learned how to fight smarter. The shift wasn't immediately visible in headlines or maps. It emerged gradually, in fewer losses per mission, in pilots returning home, in victories no longer bought at impossible cost. By early 1944, when the Hellcat entered the stage, the Thach Weave was second nature, the invisible foundation on which a generation of U.S. Navy aces was built. In combat, a maneuver lasts seconds, but its consequences can echo for decades. And for the men who lived through those seconds, the difference between life and death had been reduced to a single, disciplined turn. When the Pacific War drew to a close in 1945, the U.S. Navy had achieved total air dominance, a transformation that began not with a new aircraft or weapon, but with a change in how pilots thought. From the burning decks of Midway to the long twilight skies over Okinawa, the Thach Weave had become second nature, as instinctive as breathing. Veterans returning from the war often spoke not of grand victories or medals, but of the moments they survived because of that maneuver. Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, the famed ace who had once flown alongside Thach, described the Weave as a lifeline that tied every man in the air together. Even in his final missions, O'Hare used the tactic, adapting it to the faster, more powerful F4F Hellcats that now ruled the Pacific skies. In post-war training manuals, the Navy credited Thach by name, a rare honor in military aviation. Naval Aviation Training Bulletin No. 89, 1946, outlined the maneuver in diagrams almost identical to Thach's first chalkboard sketches aboard Enterprise. The caption read simply, "Standard Defensive Pattern. Section Defense. Thach." But the influence didn't end with World War II. When jet aircraft entered service in the late 1940s, instructors still taught the principle behind the Weave. Never isolate, always cover your partner. At the dawn of the Korean War, U.S. Navy F-9F Panther pilots reported using adapted Weave maneuvers to counter the nimble Soviet-built MiG-15s, proof that the logic of Thach's design transcended technology. Even decades later, in the Vietnam War, American pilots referenced Thach's name when describing defensive pair tactics used against fast-moving MiG interceptors. It had evolved from a maneuver into a doctrine of mutual protection, a philosophy written into every generation of U.S. aviation. Japanese records captured after the war confirmed just how deeply the maneuver had unsettled their confidence. Former Zero pilot Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces, recalled in his memoir, "After Midway, we noticed the Americans no longer feared us. Their planes moved in patterns we could not break. It was as if we were fighting an enemy who had discovered a secret code. That code was teamwork." When Thach retired from the Navy in 1967 as an admiral, he remained humble about his contribution. In interviews, he often downplayed personal credit, emphasizing instead the spirit of cooperation that defined American airmen. He told one reporter, "War forces you to learn fast. But what we learned wasn't just how to shoot better, it was how to trust better." By the time of his death in 1981, the Thach Weave was still being taught, not only in U.S. naval academies, but in Allied air forces around the world. Its simplicity made it timeless. Its philosophy made it immortal. In 1994, the U.S. Navy named a destroyer in his honor, USS Thach, FFG-43, a fitting tribute to a man whose greatest weapon was coordination. Every sailor aboard that ship would come to know his story. How one pilot, in the chaos of 1942, refused to accept defeat and found a pattern that changed the course of air combat forever. The maneuver that began as an act of survival became a symbol of American ingenuity, proof that courage, when guided by reason, can rewrite the rules of war itself. History often remembers wars by their weapons: the thunder of artillery, the steel of tanks, the roar of engines. But sometimes the true turning points are drawn not in fire, but in thought. John Thach's Weave was not born in a laboratory or a general's office. It was born in the cockpit, a space where seconds decide everything. It came from observation, logic, and trust between men whose lives depended on each other. In that sense, it was more than a tactic. It was an act of faith. Faith that coordination could triumph over chaos, that unity could overcome speed, that calm precision could defeat raw aggression. It became a quiet embodiment of the American spirit in the Second World War. Inventive under pressure, practical in design, fearless in execution. While nations fought for supremacy through numbers and machines, Thach's maneuver reminded the world that strategy, the human mind, remained the most decisive weapon of all. In the skies above the Pacific, where courage and death met in the same heartbeat, that truth became visible. Every American pilot who turned toward his wingman instead of away carried forward a lesson older than the war itself. That survival and victory come through cooperation. And long after the last zero fell from the sky, the pattern endured, a dance of trust drawn in vapor and smoke, echoing the moment when one man's calm decision changed the future of air combat. How one pilot's unbelievable escape maneuver became standard training for every American squadron, and a lasting testament to ingenuity under fire.